And with that, welcome again to the Stewardship Network's monthly webcast. My name is Rob Luzinski, and again, I am the community coordinator of the Stewardship Network. And I would like to give you a little introduction to the Stewardship Network before we get started today. So first, a little bit about us. TSN is a 501c3 nonprofit organization with an award-winning 20 plus years of history within the field. We are now serving 30 plus place-based TSN member communities and fiscally sponsored projects across the Great Lakes and across the country. And in addition, many TSN programs like this one that you're watching right now are available to everybody. Our mission is we exist to connect, equip, and mobilize nature's caretakers. So I'd like to explain a little bit more about the different aspects of our mission now. Connect. Through decades of collaboration, we've become a nexus of vital stewardship knowledge, and we're committed to sharing it widely. Equip. We remove hurdles so that stewards can pour more energy into their ecosystems and into their communities. And mobilize. In supporting nature's caretakers wherever they are, we amplify collaborative stewardship efforts here at home and nationwide. Now I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into some of those, once again, examples of those aspects of our mission. So we were really excited to be invited to be a part of the Michigan Invasive Species Coalition's recent annual meeting. So thank you to Amanda Ruffini for inviting us, one of our treasured member community coordinators. And thank you to Bob Zamet on our team for having joined that meeting. It was a pleasure to be a part of it, and just to review some of the programs we've built just for stewards like you folks. You can learn more about the Michigan Invasive Species Coalition at michiganinvasives.org. Wonderful organization that connects invasive species coordinators across Michigan and does some great knowledge sharing and networking there. We really appreciate the work that they do. And once again, thank you to Amanda for inviting us to be a part of it. Next, equip. Gloves, one of our favorite things to update you on. So field season preparations are clearly underway, and Gloves for Good has been booming. We have to let you know that be advised, this surge has left us looking at a little bit limited stock, likely for the rest of March. So if you go to the form and you see that some of the sizes or some of the types of gloves that you were hoping to see are not available, you could still order any of the ones that are available, but we're hoping to have more stock relatively soon, so be on the lookout for that. And special thanks to everybody who got this done early, but we'll help everyone that we can. So once again, don't be discouraged if you don't see the type of gloves that you're looking for, that we're hoping to have a restock relatively soon. I also need to shout out that we recently crossed the threshold of over 55,000 pairs of gloves distributed through this program, which is absolutely incredible. For some of you folks that have been around for a while, you'll remember the early days of the gloves program, and we were doing very small numbers, and it started as a very small kind of side hustle initiative, and it's now become one of our really treasured programs here at the Stewardship Network. So thank you to everybody that makes that possible, and please do visit stewardshipnetwork.org/gloves if you would like to learn more and make your glove order. Now we have some updates about our CRM system that we'd like to tell you about. So we've been working hard since TSN conference to implement an all new digital plumbing for better experiences for both internal staff and also for our end users such as yourselves. If you want to fine tune your TSN email experience, you can check out the link below, stewardshipnetwork.org/email. You'll notice that things look a little bit different, but we're hoping that you will find, as we have, that this new experience will be smoother and will just work better in general. We're really excited about this update to our internal systems, and we hope that you will be too. Please watch for our emails possibly landing in weird folders over the next few weeks. So if you are notice that you haven't seen a TSN email in a while, maybe check your spam or some other place within your inbox, just in case our new email provider gets caught up in those filter systems. And a little side note that our email subscribers are going to be the first people to learn about the glove restock. So if you are interested in knowing when we restock more sizes of gloves, more types of gloves, please do make sure you're on our email list. That is a great way to get updated as soon as possible. You will get priority access to that information. And lastly, mobilize. We are so excited that we are gearing up after the conference. The next big thing we do is, of course, our annual Spring Challenge. We'll be kicking it off on April 8th of this year, and it will be going through June 30th. And the Spring Challenge, we encourage all of us to do more together. So now I'd like to tell you a little bit about the great history we have with this program. So since 2008, we have had over 462,000 total hours of stewardship reported, over 71,000 total participants in the program, over 13.5 million in work hour value that has been submitted, and over 2.5 million total pounds of invasive plant species removed from local ecosystems. We are incredibly proud of those numbers, but we have to say we share that pride with all of you because the program simply would not be possible without all of your support. If you visit stewardshipnetwork.org/spring, right now you'll see a little bit of an overview of the program, and mainly you'll hear us bragging about how great of a year last year was in 2025. But pretty soon, within the next couple of weeks, we're going to start rolling over that same webpage to talk about the 2026 challenge. So we encourage you all to visit that website if you'd like to celebrate the success of last year and look out for updates coming soon about this year's spring challenge. And please do participate. We love seeing all of your stories and photos of the great stewardship work that you're doing. And look out for next month's webcast where we will do the official kickoff for that treasured program. So with that, I would like to introduce Brock Dolman, who is the co-director of Permaculture and Resilient Community Design Program at the Wildlands Program and Water Institute, a lot of great things, at the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center. And today's presentation is Fuels to Flows, bringing nature-based stewardship to the headwaters. So with that, I'd love to have you go ahead and share your screen.
All righty. Thanks so much there.
Absolutely.
How's that looking, Rob?
Yep, it is looking great. Take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, and hi everybody out there from wherever you're tuning in today. Happy to be here, and yeah, just a big thanks to the Stewardship Network for hosting this and all the great work that you just heard from Rob. That's amazing. I love all the statistics about just the incredible collaborative effort of folks getting together. So seems to be the essence of the phrase, the emergent property, where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, for sure. And I do want to just give a shout out that I was not aware of the Stewardship Network, but I'd been asked to do a talk at a local California Landscape Stewardship Network conference that was here in Sonoma County last year. And I got to meet Devin Landry, the coordinator, and then I got to meet Lisa Brush there, the CEO. And we got to talking, and one thing led to another. And so here I am today. So thanks to everybody for that. So I got a show for you. I'm gonna try to run this thing for 40-ish, 45, and then leave time for Q&A. So we'll get going here. So again, yeah, my name is Brock Dolman. I'm a wildlife biologist, conservation biologist, agroecologist. Did my undergrad at UC Santa Cruz back in the late 80s, 90s. And with a group of folks, co-founded the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center in 1994, which sits on an 80-acre piece of land in western Sonoma County that actually co-own with a group of people in a residential intentional community called Sowing Circle, SOWING. And I've been doing that now. It's our 32nd year of that work. And so going to, you can check out our website, but through our Wildlands program and our Water Institute for the last nearly 30 years now, we've been doing a whole bunch of work, and we've got our Basins of Relations training that we've done for many years, community organizing around that. We've got a whole beaver campaign. That could be a whole show in and of itself, but by all means, grab that QR code. Exciting stuff happening in California in our beaver work. Also been doing a lot of other work related to wildland stewardship and such, and vegetation diversity. A fun article in Fremontia, the California Native Plant Society Journal, back in 2016. And we do have a wildland stewardship plan that people might find of interest that I'm noting now is a decade old, since we did it back in 2015 and 16. So there's some bigger resources, but really wanting to focus on today's talk is really about some of the work that we've been doing, not just at OAC, but in a number of other places and this is really California-centric work, but in the uplands. And while we do at OAC, with many others, work in riverscapes and in what we call the beaverscape, I'm going to really focus in the uplandscape, which is those areas that are seasonal or intermittent, ephemeral drainages. Really, the vast majority of the surface area of any watershed is really the uplands, that nexus between the distributed, decentralized flow in a system and when it begins to come into various channels and such, but aren't perennial channels. Um, so the gist of this is really a coastal gully stuffing idea, if you will, and looking at thinking about our nature-based solutions for these uplandscapes. And for a long time, I've really pushed this idea that we need fewer trees as nouns, but more forest as verbs. And what is that nexus between good fire, cleaner water, sequestered carbon, and biodiversity? And how can we spare the air while we stuff the gully, in our case, to save some salamanders and salmon? And I will say that while I thank you all to all the folks who are showing up from so many other states, and it sounds like maybe a Canadian province as well. And absolutely, admittedly, this is a very Northern California, and we're in a southern end of the Pacific Northwest rainforest, so we're in a humid area with a lot of forests. But the principles and the various applications appropriately are applicable to many other places. And in fact, I've done trainings and implementation on this variations of this kind of work in a number of states and in fact on 5 continents on the planet. So I hope you can see yourself somewhere in this work appropriately. Back here to California, our governor has put forward through the state a carbon neutrality goal by 2045. And in doing that, they really recognize that we have, of 100 million acre state, we have over 33.5 million acres that are deemed to be at high risk for wildfire, of which about 12 million acres is this forested setting. And the interesting thing is that for the most part, the primary tool in the toolbox to mitigate that risk is the use of fighting fire with good fire. And I'll talk more about that. And yet, interestingly, in the forest space, there's also recognition around the need to protect biodiversity, store carbon, and protect water supply. And we think that if we're going to get to all of those goals, that we really need to pivot and, in addition to the use of fire, recognize the sense that when you're limbing and thinning and modifying vegetation in these settings, that material that comes out, which is often pejoratively referred to as slash, we don't think is trash at all. We think of it as a beneficial biomass. And our question is, what's the plan to deal with this massive amount of future beneficial biomass, not only in California, but throughout the West and actually many other states that are dealing with vegetation management and from a fire resiliency perspective. So we have a concept, we talk about our beneficial biomass portfolio. If there's any permaculture folks in the house, you'll really see that we're engaging in this protracted and thoughtful observation of on-site resources and thinking about stacking functions in a relative location using planned redundancy to honor these. And this idea here is a little bit of a game board. You can pick and choose what types of tactical approaches are appropriate for you. But in our case, instead of just solely thinking about combusting this material, we have other intentions of reutilizing the material, whether it's on-site or off-site for other beneficial purposes. Again, on the topic of prescribed fire and cultural burning, good fire, we've been burning at OAC since the late 90s, first started doing that, or it was as sexy as it is today. We've done some more recent burns a few years ago collaboratively, and so we're all in on fire as one of the elemental forces to engage with. And in the context of our landscape, and these are some images from OAC back a couple decades ago, we've had a legacy of logging multiple times. Our property's been logged over 3 times since the 1860s. And then yet we've had a fire suppression for that entire time. And so we have these really intense, overstocked, many cases for us, Douglas fir monocrops that are very flammable. They're converting hardwoods, our chaparral, our coastal prairies. And so we're just trying to engage in modifying that and managing for our ecosystem diversity and mosaics. And so for us, again, before we put prescribed fire on the ground, if we believe slash is not trash, and we actually think that it's a beneficial biomass, we're going to use that material that was a fire problem to be a solution for our water quantity, our water quality, our carbon sequestration, our biodiversity. And so I'm going to talk about some of this kind of work that we've been doing again at OAC and other places. So I really ask folks about, as you're looking at these landscapes, what is the fate of this material? And our sense of the fate of fuels to flows is, while there is the fire triangle and combustion is a tool in the toolbox, we think actually compost is critically important and neglected as an additional means of utilizing this organic biomass. And California's done a lot of really important work, really promoting fire. And in fact, there's this 2022 state plan about expanding the use of beneficial fire. And while there are, beneficial fire. And while there's a lot of really important trainings around folks becoming burn bosses, I'm really promoting the idea, we at OAC and others that are working with, about what it would be a parallel plan that could look like holistically that would also expand the use of beneficial biomass. I think we need biomass bosses as much as we need burn bosses. In fact, I think most burn bosses ought to holistically be integrative biomass bosses. And so one can dream. We're working on this idea with our state agencies. But there has been, a lot of interesting studies. And this is a paper in prep with Jordan Jacobs et al. And with Dr. Karen Poe, looking at mountain meadows in California, in the Sierra Nevada, Southern Cascades. We have a lot of mountain meadows, many of which are degraded, legacy impacts, the removal of beaver, increasing roads, the ultimate incision of these meadows, the dewatering and dehydration, and then the invasion of those by dryland plants, sagebrush or lodgepole pines or other plants. And so there's a big push to restore these mountain meadows, and folks who are saying, well, we got to burn the meadow plain to remove those woody invasives. And that's great. But what I think a lot of us recognize qualitatively and intrinsically in this study's promoting and recognizing that quantitatively is that if you don't stabilize the channel and retain the water and increase the retention and lateral spreading and saturation within the water, if your goal is to restore wet meadows by re-wetting them, putting fire on them actually hastens the desiccation and dehydration. And we have to hold the water if we want to restore these systems. And I think one of the interesting pieces is California, like many places in not just the US, but across the world, is traditional ecological knowledge in the use of fire. Cultural burning is something that has been happening since time immemorial in California in a really big way. And we have some amazing fire practitioners, native folks, especially Tribal Chairman Ron Good of the North Fork Mono is one of our favorite elders on that. And I love this quote he said in a workshop, online workshop last year, this idea that he was talking about, his point is fire is about water, and that everybody always says to him, I thought you guys were the fire guys. And he's like, no, we're the water guys. Because when we bring back the water, you refresh the resources, and that holds more water. And that's the whole point of restoration. And Jeanette Acosta, an indigenous ethnobotanist and cultural fire practitioner, I really appreciate her point. It's like water's life. And fire follows water, and beauty follows fire and water. And so as someone who's a bipedal sac of saline solution, and as a biologist who recognizes that while the central atom of life is carbon, the central molecule of life is water on planet water. And the idea of no water, no life is not just a quaint phrase. And so for any of you out there who are tracking this amazing miraculous equation called photosynthesis that's been happening for 3.2 billion years. And you should take a breath and thank that for the free oxygen and all of that complex carbohydrates that come out of it. But there's two equal molecular inputs into this process with sunlight driving it. And that's CO2 and H2O. And with the really important work about trying to reduce greenhouse gases and the accumulated CO2 in the atmosphere through recognizing carbon sequestration through increasing photosynthesis, we're all in on that. But the beauty of it is that H2O is the limiting factor of the capacity of those systems for photosynthesis to really function. And carbon follows water. And for anyone in California, let's go look at the Mojave Desert versus the Pacific Northwest rainforest of the redwoods if you don't believe that water is the driver, since CO2 is roughly equal in both those bioregions. And we at OAC have been working because we're in Salmon Nation here in California, in the coastal California, working on our endangered salmonids for a long time. And I really appreciate this article by David Drale et al., looking at the salmon and subsurface and connecting hill slope storage capacity and the infiltration in the uplands as relates to the duration of in-stream flows, especially in our systems out here. And I think this is something that for a long time by many folks hasn't been connected. And a lot of folks work in the main stem down in the perennial waterways doing that habitat work, and that's really critical. But if the upland sponges aren't connected, if that rainfall isn't converted into groundwater through the various detention processes, then we end up having dry rivers. And so I will admit I've been spreading my slow water movement meme for several decades now. So for those of you who know the slow it, spread it, sink it, store it, share it phrase, that's something I coined in the early 2000s and have worked with folks all over the country, and in fact in the Okanagan Basin some years ago, and have been really pushing this idea for a long time. It comes out of the Clean Water Act and stormwater work in urban, suburban areas, but in our rural residential, in our greater forestry, rangeland, and agricultural sectors, it's as valuable and as needed as well. This is a peer-reviewed paper I wrote with Dr. Matt Deitch about a decade ago now, looking at summer base flows and really thinking about decentralized water management regimes. And that's a lot of what I'm really working on, which connects to the stormwater permits around non-point source pollution and such for those folks who do that kind of work. A group of us spent a lot of time on this over a decade in various Russian River tributaries, trying to restore in-stream flows for coho salmon, steelhead trout, and there's a number of these stream flow improvement plans that I would reference folks to have a look at. You can find them all online. But at some point, I'm really interested in, as a conservation biologist, agroecologist, ultimately a Gaianist, is to the degree that we believe that change is the only constant out there, then really my question for many of us is as a ecologist who's been really interested in disturbance regimes is can we act, or are we acting as agents of degenerative or regenerative disturbance regimes? And the touch too much degenerative clear cutting realm, I think, is a degenerative disturbance, but the no touch, leave it alone, let nature heal itself, especially in these massively impacted systems that have had such touch too much degeneration, and then they're being left alone, but fire is being suppressed, for instance, has resulted in these degenerative scenarios as well, both biologically and hydrologically, as well as obviously fire. And so I'm really interested as a reconciliation ecologist in some ways here. What's the Goldilocks regenerative disturbance regime touch? How do we participate and bring our opposable thumbs, our frontal lobe, and begin to act as keystone species again to help regenerative disturbance regimes on behalf of all life for all generations for all time? And I do want to just offer up this caveat, because I will be using the word thinning, and thinning is a trigger word for many people, and I understand why that is, because there's a lot of the use of thinning as a euphemism by industrial, extractive, corporate folks who want to support this idea of thinning. And so I will say that, quote, not all thinning is done equally, and there are different expressions of it, or even the guise of the so-called salvage logging, which I feel like I've witnessed a number of projects that are trying to sell us on the notion that we need to salvage log after fires, and I think it's basically just oftentimes an industrial extractive methodology cloaked as somehow a fire mitigation strategy, and there's a lot of need for conversation in that. So that's not what I'm promoting when I'm talking about thinning. What I do recognize, and I think people should recognize for a long time, and if you've never read the book by John Perlin called Forest Journey, roughly the tagline is like the role of wood in the development of civilization. I would highly recommend that read to everybody. Starts with the Sumerians and the Fertile Crescent and Tigris Euphrates, Gilgamesh epic 10,000 years ago. And it's basically a fast-moving story of watershed deforestation, degradation, desiccation, civilization collapse, move to the next watershed. Middle East, Europe, North Africa, and then it goes to North America. And I think there's a lot of modern data that also recognizes that deforestation drives dehydration, degradation, and decline. I'm I have witnessed that and don't really agree with that. The other thing that we're finding a lot out here in the West Coast is these systems that have been overlogged but fire suppressed, and then they get overgrown with these what we often refer to as dog hair thickets, if you will. That overstocking of young, fast-growing trees, in our case, especially these conifers, the dry season evapotranspiration demand on the water budget, on the expense side of the budget, appears to be pretty significant. And there's been some preliminary work by Jeremy Kobor and Matt O'Connor that maybe in some of our watersheds, 10 to 15% of the flow that would otherwise be getting into the stream for the salmonids is being utilized by these fast-growing overstocked trees in the uplands. And so that's a part of the fewer trees, more forest game for me. And so I'm interested in the idea that let's make haste with zero waste, because it's time to connect our fire fears with our water woes by turning our fuels into flows, right? And so we've been doing a lot of this limbing and thinning and managing the fire fuel load by thinning individual trees, by retaining certain trees, by limbing the fire ladders off the trees that we're retaining, in some cases creating snags for habitat. And then at some point, though, the question is, what do you do with all that organic matter? But I will say that while there are limits to growth, I believe we actually can limit for growth. And that's a regenerative disturbance practice. And so I appreciate a lot of the work that's been happening where there's a lot of effort to do fuel load management, vegetation management, again, reduce these fuel loads. And unfortunately, I feel like the dominant practice of what to do with the slash is to put it into these 4x4 burn piles and then have a second crew come back with more money and time and energy to then burn those piles and send that material to the atmosphere as fast as possible. And while burn piles are absolutely important as a tool in the toolbox, I've done hundreds of them. In these areas, these special areas that are within the zone where like this, where they're literally the burn pile, what it took the laborers to avoid falling into the gully here that's eroding and directly delivering dirt and sediment to kill coho and steelhead not very far down from this image, versus the opportunity that we could spare the air and stuff the gully to save salmon and salamanders as well. And so there are strategic polygons within our areas in these uplands where I think of them as the stuffable polygons at some distance adjacent to these areas that are actively eroding and incising and dewatering while they dirty our rivers downstream. In California, because we have a Port of Cologne Act and the state manages the Clean Water Act on behalf of the federal government, permits are needed to put this fill in waters of the state, which is any channel with a defined bed and bank. And so we have a state water board with 9 North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board. Then we have our Department of Fish and Wildlife, and both of those agencies have a permitting process to do this work. And so we at OAC have done those permits initially back in 2021, and we are working with and supporting a number of other folks, regional parks, private property owners, other NGOs and tribes on replicating these permits to increase the pace and scale of the application of this work, again, in these first order upland systems. The permitting is different if you get into perennial waterways and things like that downstream where there are fish, and there may be a federal nexus with waters of the US and Army Corps and those kinds of things like 404s. Currently at this point, because of Sackett versus EPA in 2023, the Supreme Court ruling, these upland first order systems today, with all of our consultations with Army Corps, do not need 404 permits. So we at OAC have taken advantage of a number of various local, state, and federal cost share programs, and had gotten some money and have been doing some work, especially back in 22 and 23. And we love to work with volunteers, with other folks, and bring them on. These are some Sonoma State University students helping us out as part of a class they were doing, these agents of regenerative disturbance regimes. We've worked with youth, and this is some imagery from 2001, where we were doing some projects with Marine Conservation Corps at the time. So notice in this image, there's on the left, it says the live oak. So pay attention to that little group of live oaks, and then look at all the dead and dying Doug fir thickets there. So that day, these folks, we thinned out all that thicket. There's the live oaks now opened up. We created these channel spanning biodams, and we began to do some gully stuffing there. And then we actually revisited this thing 22 years later. That original dam was still intact. It had broken down, and it was this beautiful organic matter. We rebuilt those dams. We added a whole lot more stuffing in that system, and we continue to produce cleaner water while we're composting in situ all of that organic matter. And that's something that there is a wonderful little video we made, an 18-minute video about gully stuffing that I'll have a link to at the end as well. But this is a screen grab of a 3.5-minute animation that we did that I think folks might find of interest on just this technique of basically we're doing upland waterway stabilization techniques, again, using this on-site resource that's adjacent in a relative location to these waterways that are have been so impacted due to the legacy of land use. Typically, when you clear cut or overgraze or plow, put in a bunch of roads, hydrologically derange the runoff coefficient, increase the imperviousness of the system so that you have less infiltration and more runoff, and you drive the velocity and volume of runoff harder and faster, more flashy, that gets to our streams, that then commences this process of incising streams, of degrading and down cutting streams, which both delivers dirt to our waterways and increased sedimentation issues and such, but it also, like any person knows, if you want to drain a wetland, a farm field, you ditch it and you drop the base elevation. And that's what upland incised streams do, is they're basically ditches that as you pull the plug on the bathtub of the base of the channel, you keep dropping the elevation. You laterally increase the hill slope hydrology, dehydration, the loss of hill slope capacity to store water simultaneously. A group that we've worked with for a number of years, which I really want to lift up here, is both the entity called North Bay Jobs with Justice, and then there's a parallel for-profit entity called Resilience Works in Sonoma County. And these folks work with immigrant farm workers and who have their own traditional ecological knowledge. They come from their own countries, many of whom are indigenous peoples, but they're up here, they're doing really good work, and in many cases they're being exploited in various industries. And so this is really an ecological restoration workforce training support, like a just transition framework for these folks. And we've really done a lot of collaboration and training with them, and they're amazing groups of people. And so just want to lift their work up. Here's a job we were doing with a North Bay Jobs with Justice Resilience Works crew on a property next door to OAC. And I often talk about our fuels to flows workflow sequence. You've got the sawyers who are cutting the stuff down. You got the swampers who are taking that material and are skidding it or swamping it to the project site, where they're then staging that material before then you have the stuffers. And so you have different people that in different relationships, from the source of the material, the prepping of the material, the delivery and staging of the material, and then the integration and installation of the material. And so we, as part of our permits with the Regional Water Quality Control Board, we had to do some qualitative monitoring, some photo monitoring. And so we, after a couple of years, we finished on this 40 acres. We submitted this monitoring report. So I just want to show you a couple of photos of that. We've got some before and after photos on that. So Jim Coleman there, who is from Hale, Michigan, by the way. And he's about 6'1" there. So the incision and gully he's standing on is a 5-foot plus system there. And we limb the forest, thin the forest, and then where he's standing, when we begin to work on that, we will lay down a bed of gully green gauze in there. The tips of our conifers are green material. The tips are facing up. They're compacted in contact with the base of the gully. And then you start laying in the sticks and twigs and longer logs, leave them as long as possible, more green, more brown, more green, more brown, layer it up, connect it to the edges, fill in all the holes, and elevate that system up. So you're, for the gardeners in the house, when you hear me say brown, green, brown, green, brown, green, add water and life, you should probably be hearing me tell you that I'm describing what you all know as a compost pile. And that's what this ultimately is a compost pile. It's kind of a version of a hygge culture. If people know the work of Sepp Holzer, this Austrian permaculturalist, some people may see an analog to that work here as well. And then what's really cool about these, and I've done these at OEC, I have some that are now 30 years old, and I have some that are 6 months old, and everywhere in between, is that as that compost begins to break down because we're intercepting the sheet flow and all the organic matter being delivered from above, these systems are breaking down, turning into this really intense, almost 100% organic matter humus compost pile that's moistened. And the adjacent trees that were left, as we have fewer trees but more forest, they then grow their roots into this and lock it up. And so we increase the health and vitality of the trees that remain by giving them a food source and a water source as we increase the hill slope hydration and storage retention while we thin the forest, reduce the ET competition with the other trees, and we can help grow bigger forests faster and better that are more fire resilient while we produce cleaner water downstream and sequester the carbon, right? This is another gully system here, and Hannah standing there, and then after, what it looks like after we stuffed it. Another angle, a little bit more downstream on that gully, pre and post filling. In some cases, I'm a herpetologist first and foremost, and I know that there are some spots in some of our creeks that will retain ponded up water in the channel for a number of months later into the dry season. And in our case, rough-skinned newts take advantage of that as little breeding habitats. And so instead of fulfilling the stuffing of that gully there, we may pivot to a head cut treatment that retains that open space to retain that pool for, in this case, a rough skin newt breeding habitat. So again, being really responsive and holistic in our thinking, our observation, and our application of these techniques. And in some cases, we have both deeply incised gullies where we're going to do the gully gauze, green gauze, fill it all the way up to the top, like I described. But in some cases, if we have any legacy floodplains or terraces that have been disconnected due to that incision, we may, once we get the gully filled all the way to the top, shift from the parallel packing and filling to perpendicular structures so that once the water gets kicked up to the top of the gully, we can then laterally spread it through the full process space of bank to bank of the historic flood terrace to increase the surface area and opportunity for the detention of that water and the slowing, spreading, sinking, storing, and sharing of that water. Very much taking a cue from our beaver friends, and there's different ways and designs to do that. We have a lot of these long linear members because we're thinning Douglas fir, and so we keep those poles as long as possible and build these somewhat kind of inverted triangular shapes that are filled with vines and dug in a little bit into a trench as a bioberm, a perpendicular bioberm. We have a bunch of upland head cuts, those nick points where the head cut, as the water flows, that scouring process, that Cuisinarting process, the rototillering process of the energy of the water is driving the head cut to migrate up. Some people get surprised to understand that while water's flowing downhill, erosion goes upstream. It goes uphill as the nick point lip fails and collapses and liquefies, and the lateral slopes liquefy and wash down. These incised waterways tend to migrate up and get wider and deeper and wider and deeper and longer. And so we need to stabilize these nick points and these head cuts as much as possible for us. And so we do that with a whole treatment around stabilizing it again with this gully stuffing technique. We have lots of these at OAC, the legacy of our logging area. And so we're again filling those and increasing the aggradation and water retention while we also mitigate the head cutting and the delivery of fine sediment that's so impactful to our salmon downstream. In some cases where we don't have such a defined channel, but water's beginning to accumulate in these areas. So imagine the more upland dispersed sheet flow kinds of areas. We will create what I call these basically a perpendicular plethodontid talus or a contour carbon catcher. If people in the stormwater world know what a straw wattle is, it's a very similar idea to that, or a silk fence that you place on contour. And so that's what we're doing here. We're using that material. We're laying it on dead level contour, perpendicular to the fall line, iteratively putting these on with a high frequency if you can. And then you basically get these mini depositional zones in the uplands as your first attack to slow and spread and sink water before it gets to that defined channel where you're then seaming up the head cut or mitigating the incision. And this is all well before we get down to the riverscape and the beaverscape. We do have these really cool salamanders out here. They're plethodontid salamanders. They are often thought of as lungless salamanders. They can breathe through their skin. They don't need to go to water to breed. They can do their breeding in the leaf litter and lay their eggs and that kind of stuff. We have 4 species at OAC specifically here. We have our California slender salamander in the upper left there. We've got our arboreal salamander in the lower left. We got a black salamander in the center. We got ensitinas there. And I did throw in that we also have these really cool native terrestrial snails like our redwood sideband. But what's really fun about the salamanders and what I witness a lot is that these, I call them perpendicular plethodontid taluses again, because those sticks and limbs and branches and organic matter that stay moist longer have become critical of wildlife habitat piles for many species, but especially these salamanders. And there was a really cool study done back in 2013 in Northern California in Humboldt County, where these authors, kind of like a trophic cascade study, similar to say how the wolves in Yellowstone were there or not, the predators. In this case, in the leaf litter with invertebrates, these salamanders are the wolves of the leaf litter. And when you remove them, the cruncher munchers of the invertebrates actually break the leaf litter down faster and increase the rate at which that material is oxidized and becomes a greenhouse gas and being emitted. But when you bring in the salamanders, they're eating these little invertebrates and they're creating an equilibrium with those grazers, if you will, because of this predator relationship, this keystone predator relationship. And as they found there with the presence of these salamanders, those soils could sequester an additional 179 pounds of carbon per acre in the forest instead of going to the atmosphere because of the salamander. So how can we really begin to think about all the ways that biology is engaging here? Our land has a breeding endangered, federally for us, endangered northern spotted owls. And one of the things that's interesting is after the post clear cutting and logging, where they lost so many of their nest trees, we got these dog hair thickets, and the owls couldn't really access the territory, and they're part of the reason why they're endangered. And so we had done a limbing and thinning process. I showed you some photos back in 2002, and we did not have owls breeding there. As an endangered species vertebrate biologist, I'd been working on spotted owls prior to moving to OAC. I was very familiar with them as an owl caller, and we did not have them breeding at OAC. Within 5 years of us doing the limbing and thinning on this 40-acre project and opening it up and increasing the space and also building brush piles, which created habitat for the dusky-footed wood rat, which is the primary food source, we got a pair of spotted owls to move into our third growth forest that we had limbed, and they successfully bred for 12 years. They made a pair up until just a couple years ago, where now the barred owl, which is native for many of you guys on the East Coast, but isn't native here in the West Coast, but has found its way here of its own and found a lot of happy places in the forest because we've created great barred owl habitat with our clear cutting and such. And so unfortunately, we do not have our spotted owls in the last 2 years because they've been displaced by the barred owl. But nonetheless, the proof was in the pudding that we can do this work, and that regenerative disturbance regimes, by being active participants in dealing with these landscapes that have been so plundered so hard for so long. And if we step in and with humility participate as and regeneratively, we can create conditions conducive for salamanders, for owls, for clean water, for salmon recovery, for fire resiliency. And then just another angle on this is that to the degree that one, again, I showed you the state's goal of trying to reach carbon neutrality by 2045. And so imagine if we're going to do limbing and thinning on millions of acres, how many of those acres are stuffable acres, if you will? Not all of it is, but a significant amount of them are. How many millions of tons of organic matter, beneficial biomass, could be reutilized instead of being burnt to the atmosphere on site for all these benefits? A quick study that we did of the 4 upland tributaries that we stuffed. We did about just shy of 1,000 feet of channel was ultimately filled. And in the end, it was about 75 tons of carbon is now slowly holding water and sequestering and slowly breaking down into the soil water pool and life pool versus the atmospheric pool. And that amount of carbon, interestingly to us, is the same amount of carbon basically that Jeff Bezos used for his little 11-minute space trip. So you're welcome, Jeff. We offset your space flight for 11 minutes with our 75 tons. This is on just about 10 acres of land in 4 areas with 1,000 linear feet. It's not that big, but if you scale it, it's really big. And so that's one of the questions I get a lot is, yeah, that's great, but can gully stuffing really scale? And it's kind of, I often think about like these guys must have had a conversation. This guy's like, Henry, there's no way in hell that clear cutting all this damn old growth by hand is going to scale. Imagine that misery whip they had to do. And this guy's like, Luke, quit being a naysaying whiner. You know, we've got the full weight of society behind us. It scaled to clear cut all of the old growth across North America because the entire society got behind that. Scaling isn't intrinsically, it's about the political, social, economic inertia and will. It's not about the specific tactic, right? So gully stuffing will scale if we all choose to get on board with it. Process-based restoration scales if we choose to get on board with it. It's a choice. Thankfully, a lot of people have made the choice, and we've been happy to work with a lot of folks. We did some partnerships here with the Golden Gate National Recreation Area in Marin County, their Tennessee Valley area. They're removing invasive eucalyptus, and they have these big gullies. And so we're like, great, that's a problem. We've got a solution. And so here was a training, a staff training we did on gully stuffing work. And the top center image is Kate Lundquist, who I co-direct the Water Institute with. We've worked a lot with Sonoma County Regional Parks, who has 20,000 acres in the county, and all of those acres are none of those lands are in pristine, perfect old growth condition, right? They've all been industrially interacted with by a settler colonist frame for the last 150 years. So this is a project was funded in part by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and working with Swiftwater Design and Sonoma County Regional Parks that we did on a really large scale series of gully stuffing and head cuts. We've worked in another regional park that's in our Dutchbill Creek watershed, the Lower Russian River, very close to OAC. And this is called Monte Rio Redwoods Regional Park. And Monona Heaviland right there in the lower right is so happy. And we've been doing staff trainings, and we have several years of work, and we've got more projects to do in that park. This was an interesting thing we observed in that park is that there had been a little gully stuffing project as part of that in a small little incised upland system that was being driven by some road runoff. It was probably only 2 feet wide and 2 feet deep, pretty steep and short. But the staff got in there and plugged it up. And because there's a little bit of seep that comes into it late in the spring, it had really wetted up nicely, and it had brought that wetted water up to the surface and kind of spread it out. Unbeknownst to the CAL FIRE and the parks folks who had a 30-acre prescribed burn, in their burn plan, nobody knew that this was here. So they burned the whole thing over. And what you're seeing here is I was there a couple days after. It was still smoldering in many places. And you can see all the white ash everywhere. But right where our little wetted gully stuffing spot was, look at all the unburned needles, all the areas that didn't burn. It's a similar version, like Dr. Emily Fairfax and Whittle have that amazing paper called Smokey the Beaver, talking about beaver habitat at landscape level, mitigating fire spread. This was a little mini like stuffed gully, Smokey the Stuffed Gully version, which I think is a case study that I'm really intrigued with. We've done a bunch of work up in the Navarro watershed with Trout Unlimited, Mendocino Redwood Company, Mendocino Resource Conservation District. We're doing a training with California Conservation Corps in upland gully stuffing. And this is an interesting project because there was a deeply incised, entrenched gully that was delivering dirt straight to a Coho stream that had dewatered this whole kind of upland alluvial fan. And so I went up to where the switch is, where the incision starts at the head of the fan. We plugged that up, we plugged up the ditch, and we intentionally kicked the water. We call that a switch. We kicked the water out onto the terrace, and then we put a series of structures on the terrace to increase the detention rate, the time we can hold water there to allow it to slow spread and sink into there. And thankfully, these folks, through with Dr. Mia Van Docto and this unpublished information here, had instrumented this in advance with piezometers, groundwater wells, in a control watershed and a treatment watershed. And this is some preliminary data all the way over on the right there that shows post-treatment how much more water volume below groundwater and surface water we have been able to store just 1 year after that project. So it's very encouraging on the water quantity side. We just recently did a project with North Bay Jobs with Justice on our neighbor's place. This was really fun because we were removing encroaching Douglas fir into a California coastal prairie, which is the most biodiverse grassland ecosystem in North America and only less than 2% intact in the state. And then we use that for upland gully stuffing. OAC's participated with a number of organizations and agencies and NGOs in Sonoma County in workforce development training and workshops and that kind of stuff, really trying part of the scaling here. We have a draft document that's a best management practice guidebook right now that will soon be published for folks. It's got opportunities for these upland techniques. A teaser here, and here's a link for this. I've worked with a man named Jim Pavarsi at the University of Chicago's Data Science Institute on a found gully model that's looking to use LIDAR, comparative LIDAR data over 10 years to search for differences in erosion or deposition over time to try and help us find areas that are more actively incising. And so this is only running for Sonoma County right now, but if there's modeler geeks out there, contact me. We worked with our community alliance with family farmers on gully stuffing information. We've got a website that with Pepperwood and Sonoma Ecology Center called Tending the Land that I think people might find of interest. We're doing a lot of collaborative work with a thing we call the Bohemian Collaborative now. That's got landowners over 20,000 acres within our bioregion trying to do this work together. OAC is a co-founder of a statewide organization now called the California Process-Based Restoration Network. These folks are working in the Beaverscape, the Riverscape, and the Uplandscape, and I definitely would suggest you check them out. And ultimately, this is the gist of a holistic version of as we're doing ecosystem restoration, we have to do ecosystem restoration in our Fuels to Flows campaign. And so really recognizing the rainbow opportunity of all of the agencies, federal, state, county, city, NGO, for-profit, private landowners. How do we all collaboratively come together across fire, earth, life, water, and air, and such? And so we do participate actively in public processes. And in fact, recently our Board of Forestry and Fire Protection through our CAL FIRE folks are doing an update to the California Vegetation Treatment Program, which is a programmatic EIR. And so a number of us, led by OAC with all those logos on our letter, submitted a whole series of comments to this process. And I just put a few of them that were specific to the Fuels to Flows information. So we're engaging in that and trying to cut some green tape and modernize some of these practices to really legitimize and legalize these techniques. Some folks might find this NBC news story that I did a couple years ago of interest there. We do have these gully stuffing videos I mentioned, and so you can check those out. In fact, if you grab this QR code, it'll take you to this little document where we've kind of high-graded links to make it easier for you to find a number of our process-based restoration, our Fuels to Flows resources and such. And so we do have this website in some. Go to Fuels to Flows at OAC, lots of drop-down menus. And that's what I got for you. And I'm going to stop sharing and we'll go to Q&A. All righty.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Brock. Lots to chew on there, lots of great information, and love seeing the process that you've gone through in terms of learning more about what works and what are the various challenges that you face in doing this work. So I'll try my best to get to a few questions, and also acknowledging that I think some of these questions are probably addressed in the materials that you shared. So I'm really excited about folks getting the opportunity to check those out. So one of the first questions was about that aspect of burning the brush piles versus letting them decompose. And maybe you could talk a little bit more about how you understand prioritizing the burning of those brush piles versus leaving them where they are to decompose.
Great question. I love that. Yeah, so the fun answer is often the classic, it depends. And so I think for us, when I'm doing a site assessment on a project and evaluating the development of the project scope and tactics, I'm leading with a beneficial biomass perspective. And so I'm looking at the site and I'm saying, what is the condition? There's fire lens on that, but there's also again the water quality, quantity, carbon lens, the biodiversity lens, and I'm looking at the resources that maybe need to be modified and saying how can I optimize supporting the integrity of this site in its fullness. So if there are incised waterways and or we're losing water, we're dumping dirt in there, I prioritize water quality and quantity first and foremost, and all organic matter that is appropriate and adjacent and efficient that can be repurposed to protect water quality and quantity is highest priority first and foremost. And so we limb and thin and stuff away from all of our gullies at OAC until we're far enough away where it's just not it's not affordable, it's not accessible, it's just inefficient. And then we begin to pivot to maybe I'm putting them perpendicular on the contour. I'm still trying to retain it. Maybe I'm building a wildlife habitat pile. I'm still trying to retain it on site. And at some point, maybe there's just too much material and I need to do that. And so combustion of that material in a burn pile is great. And all of that may be leading up to then setting us up for a prescribed burn, which we could come in with next, but we've got the catcher's mitts built in the gully. So after we burn it and the runoff of the ash goes, we got the catcher's mitts in place. So think holistically, prioritize your observations, and honor that biomass to solve other needs of the site in a balanced, beneficial biomass budget first and foremost before you choose to contribute it to the atmospheric pool.
Great, thank you for that. And I think we have enough time maybe for one more brief one. And it's interesting. There's a lot more in the questions, so sorry about that, everybody. But feel free, I think, to reach out to Brock and also explore the resources that he has shared. But there was a question about whether or not you prioritize if you are removing invasive species from the landscape, for example, and you know that those won't actively regenerate within these gullies. Do you ever prioritize utilizing invasive species brush that you remove for those gullies? And there's a related question that maybe you won't be able to get to, but about how dense those gullies need to be in order to be effective.
I'm all in on tag teaming invasive species removal. I've stuffed gullies with broom. We have French and Scotch broom out here, and eucalyptus, upland acacia. All of those plants won't sprout from a vegetative sprouting, so they're okay to put in the gully. You got to be aware of seeds and things, and that's an issue of the timing on that. But absolutely, if you've got invasive species material that will serve the function, absolutely use that material. I'm agnostic and opportunistic at all times with that material.
Amazing. Thank you so very much. I'm going to get into our outro slides, but really appreciate you, Brock. Thank you. Lots of great questions and comments in the chat. So thank you, everybody, for joining us, and really appreciate your presentation today. So right. Now I'm going to get over here to my share. All right. So we encourage you all to become a regular of these webcasts. They happen on the second Wednesday of the month in the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour. Now we'd like to talk to you a little bit more about some of the ones we have coming up. You can learn about the upcoming webcasts and also check out some of our archives at stewardshipnetwork.org/webcast. Next month is a big one, TSN Spring Kickoff in April. And we have a treasured guest, our keynote speaker at our 2024 Stewardship Network Conference, Evan Larson of the University of Wisconsin-Platteville, with sharing the story of fire in Great Lakes forests. Really, really excited to have him there. And so please do join us next month for our kickoff and for the great presentation. Next, we have participatory science at the leading edge of a biological invasion, European green crab in Washington State, with Emily Grayson of the University of Washington. And then in June, we have How Fear and Hope Are Reshaping Political and Biophysical Landscapes on the Northern Great Plains. That's with Daniel Alquist at the Michigan State University. With that, thank you all so much for being here today. We really appreciate you, and we hope to see you next month.